Hello! In this video, we're going to look at some of the descendants of Proto-Indo-European. Now, as we know, Proto-Indo-European is the common ancestor language for the Indo-European language family. And it has many descendants. And these descendants are grouped into multiple what we call branches, right? So each branch is one of these kind of lines that comes off of the original ancestor, and it represents a group that migrated away from the homeland of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, that Yamnaya culture in southern Russia, and they moved to a new place where they developed their own version of this language that became things like Proto-Greek and Proto-Germanic and so on, as we will see. And from there, many more languages descended. So we only are really interested in three branches of the Indo-European family tree: the Hellenic branch, the Italic branch, and the Germanic branch. And that's because the three languages that we focus on in this course, Ancient Greek, Latin, and English, come from those three branches. So I want to take a look at them and give you a sense of how they're related and a broad overview of where they each come from. We'll look at all of these in more detail in later lectures. Okay, so we start with the Hellenic. The Hellenic branch is one of the first to form, and what that means is we think that this group of people were one of the first to leave the Proto-Indo-European homeland carrying their language and culture with them, and they eventually settle in the region of modern Greece. This may have happened around 2200 BC, so over 4,000 years ago. And so when they arrive in Greece, the language that they're speaking at that time we refer to as Proto-Greek. It is a long lost language, right? I'll put a asterisk there just to show you that there's no evidence for it. It has been reconstructed to some degree, but it's only theorized that they spoke some form of Proto-Indo-European, which was evolving into its own language, and that we call Proto-Greek. Now, from there, we experience a number of splits, right, that represent different movements of people. One of those splits gave us Mycenaean Greek, right? And this is the Greek that is spoken in southern and central Greece, starting somewhere around the mid-second millennium BC. So somewhere around like 1600 BC, probably a little bit earlier than that. Mycenaean is notable because it is the first form of Greek that we have written evidence for. The Mycenaeans were an early Greek culture. They had a writing system, not the Greek alphabet, but something different. And so we actually have examples and samples of their language. So we can reconstruct that with certainty because we have it. Right? Mycenaean eventually evolves and gives way, and there's more splits to be had. But the main branch we want to follow here is that it eventually evolves in central Greece, around the region of Attica, into Attic Greek. Now, Attica is the homeland of the city of Athens. And even if you don't know a lot about ancient Greek culture, you've probably heard of Athens. It's the modern capital of Greece, and it was one of the biggest cultural centers of the classical Greek world. And so the version of Greek that evolves there is known as Attic Greek. It evolves out of the Mycenaean. It's sometimes also called Classical Greek. And this happens probably around the 8th century BC. This has already formed. Now, from Attic or Classical Greek, we get a couple different dialects, right? There's this constant splitting and changing, including one of the most important, which is, this is pronounced Koine Greek. And Koine Greek starts to form in the late 4th century BC, and it occurs because around that time, a guy named Alexander the Great, you might have heard of, was a Greek general. He conquered a large swath of territory, especially the Persian Empire. So he conquered regions that include modern Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, into Central Asia. And he set up Greek rule in those regions. And so Greek spread to a lot of people who now had to learn it if they wanted to sort of communicate with the politicians and the kings and everyone in their kingdoms. And so they learned it as a second or third language, and it sort of naturally changes thanks to that widespread usage. And one of the things that will happen is it simplifies so that lots of different people can learn it more easily. A lot of things simplify. And so Koine, it means common in Greek, is this kind of dialect of Greek that spreads throughout this huge chunk of the world where Greeks are now ruling, but it becomes a kind of simplified version. Now, Classical Greek continues to exist for a while. It'll eventually die out. But it's Koine Greek, which then will eventually evolve into medieval Greek around the 5th century AD, and then modern Greek, right, around the 15th century AD. We call that modern Greek. And so this is the Hellenic branch. It's actually kind of a small branch, despite what we have up here, because really the only modern language that comes from it is Greek, whereas a lot of the other branches have many, many more. Okay, the next branch we want to look at is the Italic branch. So the Italic branch represents a group of people who left the Proto-Indo-European mainland sometime around 1500 BC. They arrive in the peninsula of Italy and they begin to settle there. And they speak a kind of Proto-Italic. And again, this language is not attested. We don't have any evidence it actually existed. We just theorize that they must have had some sort of language that they spoke that all these other languages broke off of and evolved from. And so they too have some splits. There's a split, first of all, between what's called Sabellic and Latino-Faliscan. So I'll put Latino-Faliscan here. You don't have to know all these names. I promise you. You don't have to memorize these. I'm not going to test you on something like this. I'm just giving you a sense of how everything is evolving and related. And then there's this split here between Faliscan and Latin. Right? And the first phase of Latin proper that we know of is what we call Old Latin, which probably developed by the 6th century BC. It's a little hard to tell because the first Latin texts really don't show up until the 3rd century BC. But they're probably this Old Latin language that they are speaking, and they will continue to speak until about the 2nd or 1st century BC, when it evolves into, really it splits into Classical Latin and Vulgar Latin. This is an interesting split because it's not about place. It's not like one group of Latin speakers are here and one group's here. It's about what we call register. What situations you use language for. So Classical Latin is a formal Latin. It is the Latin that you find in literary texts, in official documents. Vulgar Latin is what people actually speak, right? This is how people just talk in their day-to-day lives. And so we distinguish these two. Now Classical Latin will eventually evolve into a late Latin form sometime around the 3rd century AD, and then it will die off. It will continue to be used in official context until it eventually dies off. Vulgar Latin, on the other hand, spreads throughout a lot of Western and Central Europe and even into North Africa, where people in the Roman Empire live and are speaking Latin. And from Vulgar Latin, we get a group of languages known as the Romance languages. It's a huge group. It's dozens and dozens of languages in multiple branches. You have a branch of Romance languages from the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, a branch in France, a branch in Romania, a branch in North Africa, a branch in Italy. And from each of these little branches, you get many, many more splits and many, many more languages. I'll just mention big amongst the Romance languages, though, are French, Italian, Spanish, you have to start abbreviating, Portuguese, right? Romanian's there as well, but those are the big languages, modern languages today that come from the Italic branch. All right, I'm running out of room. I'm gonna have to erase some of these languages. The last branch we said we're gonna look at is Germanic. The Germanic languages. So the Germanic languages are spoken by a group of people who left the homeland and went into Western, Northern Europe and reached Germany probably around 500 BC, maybe a little bit earlier. And their language that we talk about is Proto-Germanic. All right, this kind of initial language that they developed that all the other Germanic languages will develop out of. Now the Proto-Germanic language splits pretty easily based on distribution of speakers. You have an Eastern branch. This is represented by some people called the Goths and the Burgundians. That language actually dies out. We don't have any modern speakers of any descendant there. We have our northern branch. These are people who went up into Scandinavia. Think of modern like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. And they are speakers of a language called Old Norse. This is like Viking language. Right? This early phase is Old Norse. This is the language of the Vikings. And from there are more splits that happen, and we get modern languages like Swedish and Norwegian, and actually Danish and Icelandic all come ultimately from Old Norse. The last Germanic branch here is Western Germanic, right? The people who went to the western part of Germany. And they then have more splits, and from them we get sort of sub-branches, including the branch that gives us the German language. There's a branch that gives us the language of Dutch, spoken in, for instance, like the Netherlands, and then the branch that ultimately gives us English. And English itself will go through a few phases. English as a language probably just starts to be forming around 500 AD. We'll talk about this more when we look at this history more closely. And then we have really sort of proper Old English is formed by 700 AD. It lasts till about 1066. 1066 we get Middle English, and that lasts till about 1500 when Modern English kicks off. Okay, so these are the branches that we're most interested in. And because they all have a common ancestor, these languages, if you remember, are called cognates. They're related to each other. And cognates have similarities in their vocabulary, in their grammar. Sometimes these similarities are really obvious, sometimes they are less obvious, sometimes two languages are really similar, sometimes they're not very similar. It depends on a number of factors, but kind of the biggest one is how closely they're related. So if you've ever studied German or Dutch or something, you'll probably have noticed it's pretty similar to English. There's a lot of overlap. Whereas English has similarities to, Greek and Latin, but they're not as pronounced. Now, sometimes the similarities are real, like I said, sometimes the similarities are really obvious. So for instance, the English word mouse, and this is a native word, they didn't borrow it, is equivalent to, in Greek, a G up here and an L up here. The Greek word for mouse is moose. The Latin word for mouse is actually also moose. These are their native words. And they are so similar because they come from the same Proto-Indo-European word, which is moose, and they just haven't changed that much, so they remain very similar. We see it in other examples: English me, Greek me, Latin me, all coming from Proto-Indo-European me, or English 3, Greek trace, Latin trace, coming from a Proto-Indo-European tre. And in fact, these S's represent a grammatical inflectional ending. So their roots for these are tre and tre. So yeah, really, really similar. Now, in other cases, there are similarities between languages and between words and languages that are less obvious. And this is because they have changed in certain ways since they left Proto-Indo-European. So let's take a look at this example. Let's take the word heart from English. The Greek word for heart is cardia, and I'll use a hyphen to indicate the root versus the inflectional ending, so you're really working with like card. And the Latin cordis, again, is the ending, so really we're looking at chord. So heart, card, chord. They don't look so similar. And yet, they all come from a common Proto-Indo-European root, cared, right? Now, linguists have studied the ways that each different language changes from Proto-Indo-European, right? The way that the sound of the consonants and the spelling of the words and the sound of the vowels have shifted for that language. And so we end up with things like Grimm's Law. This is named after Jacob Grimm, who's actually one of the brothers Grimm from fairy tale collecting. He was also a linguist who studied Indo-European languages. And he studied very specifically English consonants and how English consonants, what patterns of change they had shown since they had left Proto-Indo-European, right? How is English, and really the Germanic languages in general, how they changed from Proto-Indo-European. And so we can use his work, as well as work that people have done on Greek and Latin, to create a kind of comparative chart. And we can talk about, okay, what was the original consonant in Proto-Indo-European? And then what does that consonant generally become in Greek, in Latin, and in English? So, for instance, in Proto-Indo-European, often when you have a kind of K there, you get in Greek a K, in Latin a C, and in English an H. And so cardia, cordis, heart, right? They all start to match up. Similarly, when you have a D in Proto-Indo-European, this tends to remain a D in Greek, remain a D in Latin, but become a T in English, which is why you have cardia, cordis, but heart, right? for this, right? The Germanic languages have changed a bit from Proto-Indo-European. There are other correspondences we can look at. A Proto-Indo-European T, for instance, tends to stay T in Greek and Latin. In English, become a TH, right? Think of mater, mater, mother, right? Pater, pater, father. And English Proto-Indo-European P, stays a P in Greek and Latin, but becomes an F in English. Pater, pater, father. Those are some of the most common, but I'll mention just 4 others. We're not going to go through all of them, but I'll look at just 4 more. Bah, this BH sound at the beginning of a word. This corresponds to a sort of PH in Greek. In Latin, it is an F or sometimes a B, and in English, a B. And we see this, for instance, in the word for brother. Frater, frater, brother. A GH, a H sound in Proto-Indo-European would become a H sound in Greek. It would become a H sound, an H here, and in English it becomes just a G sound. And so we can see this in in Latin, hostess, and English, guest. They have the same meaning, but we have a H and a G. Qua as a sound, this KW, we would say QU in English. Qua. This one's a little weird. In Greek, it could become a P or a T sound, a P or a T. In Latin, it's a qua, spelled QU, and in English, it tends to be a hua, a WH. And so we see this, for instance, in Latin quid, which means what, and then English what, right? They are from the same root. And the last one is gua. This is admittedly the weirdest one. So gua here becomes a B or D sound in Greek, a V sound in Latin, and a qua CW or QU sound in English. We see this in the trio of words. They all come from the same Proto-Indo-European root. Bios in Greek, which means life, vivus in Latin, which means living, life, and quick in English, which the original meaning of quick in English is alive. Quicksilver, for instance, is living silver. When we say the quick and the dead, we mean the living and the dead, but it's an old archaic usage of the word. Okay, so because these different languages that we're studying this semester come from branches of the same big family, Indo-European family, they are cognates and they have similarities. And again, sometimes those similarities are pretty obvious. Sometimes they're a little less obvious, but we do have some tools that can help us to see what kind of corresponds with what. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.